Can the language you speak allow you to see the future? If you read the script for the story of the rest of your life, does that mean you don't have free will? These questions are at the core of Story of Your Life, a short story by Ted Chiang. If you're not familiar with it, perhaps you know the movie Arrival, which is based on Story of Your Life. This video is going to give you a detailed explanation of the linguistics and other science of the movie Arrival and its source material that you've never seen before. The original short and the movie are beloved by linguists around the world because they're some of the only fiction where linguistics is not only involved, but very well explained and central to the plot. And in my opinion, they're both also just really good works of fiction, whether you're involved in linguistics or not. This is not a review or summary of the events or a comparison of the differences between the two versions, but there will of course be some spoilers and comparison between some notable differences in this discussion. So if you haven't read the short or seen the movie and would like to do so without spoilers, save this video for later and go ahead and do that first. There's information on where you can find both versions in the description. But if you're ready to learn about the science of these stories, let's begin. In both versions of the story, we follow a linguist, Dr. Louise Banks, and her experience in translating an alien language from our visitors known as heptapods, along with the help of a physicist. In Story of Your Life, he's named Gary, and in Arrival, he's named Ian. First, she's visited by Colonel Weber, who's in charge of the local alien contact site, who gives her a simple recording, and then he asks her if she can figure anything out. To which he says even if she had an hour-long recording, there's nothing she could really do. This is where the real linguistics gets started. She mentions that there are things that the aliens are saying that we probably can't even hear. Not just frequencies outside of human ears, but also distinctions that are meaningful to them that may not be meaningful to us. This is a real thing, even among closely related human languages or even different accents of the same language. Not only is it physically difficult to reproduce the sounds of another language or accent, sometimes we literally cannot even hear the different sounds. This is called perceptual narrowing. As a baby, your perception is open to distinguishing all sounds in human languages, but as you grow older and start acquiring your native speech, your perception narrows to your native speech, so you become an expert at distinguishing the sounds that are meaningful in the communication you regularly use, but you lose the ability to distinguish other sounds. This is discussed in more detail with the science behind it in this video if you'd like to learn more. Perceptual narrowing starts reducing your ability to hear certain vowel distinctions as young as 6 months old. And that's for sounds made with the same mouths, sounds that we are all physically capable of with the right training. Now imagine they're sounds from different anatomy, from a completely unrelated alien species. In Arrival, we don't see where the heptapod speech comes from, but in Story of Your Life, they're described as having an orifice at the top of their body that serves breathing and speaking functions, while another one at the bottom of their body is used for eating, and possibly where their food exits too. This is important because we have teeth, lips, a tongue, and a mouth shape that is designed for eating earthly foods. We can breathe through our mouth, but also through our noses, and these are features that exist in many animals long before human speech evolved, meaning that these features weren't necessarily developed for human speech. Rather, we learned to control and articulate with them to create speech and language. Not only that, but with our mouths on the front of our face, language acquisition is also visual, and babies learn sounds that are pronounced at the front of the mouth more quickly because they're easier to see. That's the reason most languages in the world have words like mama and papa to describe parents, because they're some of the first sounds that babies can make, and parents adopt those sounds to refer to themselves. Now imagine you have a heptapod with an orifice on top of their body that's only used for breathing and speech. They don't make sounds with teeth or a tongue because those are in their eating orifice. And it's harder for us to see their speech orifice to visually learn how they pronounce things. This would make learning to distinguish the sounds in their language extremely difficult. Another challenge is described in Story of Your Life when Louise first meets the heptapods. In previous fieldwork, she had translated languages in the Amazon, but she could either speak Portuguese with the informants or had previously been taught some of the basics of the target language by local missionaries. Working with the heptapods would not come with those advantages. In addition, Colonel Weber wanted them to learn as much about the heptapods as possible while teaching them as little as possible about humans, which would rely on how willing they were to share without getting anything in return. She starts with basics by demonstrating a spoken word, pointing to herself and saying, human, then to the heptapods, which prompted them to point to themselves and speak, hopefully, their word for heptapod. Story of Your Life explains that this is lucky because, and this is real linguistics again, not all cultures point with their limbs or not the same part of their limbs. Some cultures point with this finger, some use other fingers, some use elbows. In the military, we point with a knife hand. In a lot of Latino cultures, we point with our lips. Other cultures point with their chin or eyebrows. Louise points at herself and Gary plays back a recording of what she thinks is the heptapod's word for human, and she gets another utterance that she marks flutter 2. When she points at the heptapods and plays back what she thinks is their word for heptapods, they respond with flutter 2 again. This makes her think that it may mean yes or correct, which is all good, real linguistics procedure. Off to a good start, but because of the difficulties of recognizing speech mentioned earlier, she decides to try using writing, which should be highly regular and easier to distinguish morphemes, which are segments of meaning. However, their writing appears logographic, with one symbol or character representing a whole word or phrase rather than individual phonemes of speech, like Chinese writing does. This would make it harder to connect to the spoken language, but not impossible, and she does indeed make steady progress. And this is where the science fiction starts coming into play. As Louise becomes fluent in heptapod language, she starts to have flashbacks, but these aren't the typical storytelling flashbacks that are just for the audience's sake. These are memories of the future that Louise is experiencing in real time. From her perspective, she's not remembering past events. She's living through all these moments of her life without linear time. Her ability to understand and think in the heptapod's written language has given her the ability to perceive reality the way the language does, without cause and effect, but all happening at once. This is described by the linguistics concept known as the Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis. The effects of this are described in Story of Your Life, however, the hypothesis itself is not directly mentioned by name. It is explicitly mentioned in this scene of Arrival, where Ian asks Louise about the ability to rewire your brain by immersing yourself in another language, to which she responds by explaining Sapir-Whorf. Put simply, it means the language you speak determines the way you perceive reality. It's important to know that linguists today mostly don't actually subscribe to that strict interpretation known as linguistic determinism, where your language really controls your perception. However, a more relaxed interpretation known as linguistic relativity is a more widely accepted concept, which says your language merely influences your perception. In either case, while the story is rooted in this real linguistics phenomenon, it is obviously taken to a sci-fi extreme. So if the story proves or uses determinism over relativity, the end result is fantasy. No language can make people see the future of their life, even if the language doesn't have linear time. Now, we've never actually encountered an alien language before, but we're pretty confident that this wouldn't happen. Despite this fictional extreme, learning, becoming fluent, and immersing yourself in another language can indeed allow you to perceive things the way they're described in that new language. And there are real examples of language actually affecting the way you perceive time. We can see this in the languages Aymara and Quechua, which are indigenous languages in the Andes Mountains region. In English, where we think about the past being behind us and the future ahead of us as if we're walking forward through a physical timeline, in Aymara and Quechua, it's the opposite. Where we say, leave the past behind and look ahead to the future, they say that the past is ahead and the future is behind. They don't imagine us moving forward through time, rather they perceive the past as being ahead because they know the past. They can see it as if they're seeing something in front of them. And the future is behind because they can't see it and don't know what it holds. In fact, in Aymara, the translation for past is the phrase Naira Pacha, which can be literally translated to front time. And the translation for future is Pipa Pacha, which can be translated to back time. In addition to the ahead and behind visualization of time, English can also describe time with the two-dimensional distance measurement of length, as in a long time ago. However, in Spanish, they would translate that phrase to hace mucho tiempo, which literally means a lot of time ago, the way we would describe a lot of water or some other kind of three-dimensional volume. There are many more examples like these of how we represent and perceive time differently across world languages. Just think about your own language. How do you perceive time, and how does the translation compare to English? But how does the heptapod language portray time without being in order if they still need to speak words one at a time in some kind of order? In the story, it's established that the speech of the heptapods encountered all around the world is the same, just one language. That language also has completely free word order, meaning that it doesn't matter what order the words are in at all. In English, if I were to say, "You are watching a movie," that's a statement. But if I said, "Are you watching a movie?" even with the same exact intonation, that becomes a question. Heptapods are not restricted by word order to express meanings. That's also the case for many human languages. For example, even Old English had free word order. It's especially common in synthetic languages, which are ones that make extensive use of affixes and inflections. Because Old English had many different verb conjugations and noun declensions, you could get away without saying things like pronouns and prepositions. It was always clear who the subject and the object were, because they had different forms marking the word instead of a specified position in the sentence. However, human languages still have some things that need to be in a specific order, and if you asked someone to repeat something, they'd likely use the same word order again, even if it's not required. The heptapods, on the other hand, would even say the same sentence with a different word order when asked to repeat what they said. That's potentially responsible for, or maybe a result of, their lack of linear time, having absolutely zero motivation or reason to express things in any kind of order. But what really frees their mind, and eventually Louise's mind as well, is the written language. For us, writing is representation of spoken language. If you write in Korean, you are representing the way Korean is spoken. But for the heptapods, their written language is completely independent of their spoken language with its own rules. In Story of Your Life, Louise notices this here, where she explains to Gary that it's a semasiographic writing system with a completely different syntax that should be called Heptapod B to distinguish it from Heptapod A. In Arrival, this moment happens about halfway through the movie, with a voiceover of Ian explaining how Louise is the one who found out it had no correlation to the spoken language, and describing a bit about the properties of a semasiographic language. I think the representation of the writing is actually really well done in Arrival, maybe even better than Story of Your Life, because despite its importance to the story, the book can only describe it with words, whereas the movie can depict it visually. Louise does mention that humans do use some semasiographic writing, but that's for our math and musical notation, not to represent spoken language. In fact, a more modern example that you might have already used today is emojis. They convey meanings through images without representing spoken words, and the same emojis can therefore be used by speakers of any language. Although those systems that we use are specialized and limited, none of them are broad and complex enough to replace an entire spoken language the way Heptapod B can. When Louise has a breakthrough in understanding Heptapod B and being semasiographic, it's the first time in the movie that she has one of her flashbacks or visions of her child. So when she starts to really understand the language, that's when she starts to see time as the language does. Initially, Louise doesn't exactly understand what her visions are, and if it's your first time watching it, the audience might still think that these are flashbacks to a child she had in the past. It's not until much later, when Louise is talking face to face with the heptapod, that both she and the audience learn that the father who's been hinted at throughout earlier flashbacks is Ian. And with that, we understand that she's not seeing memories of the past, but experiencing the future of her life with Ian and the child they will have together. A couple remaining important things in Story of Your Life are the physics side of this and the concept of free will. In Arrival, Ian is talking to one of the physicists at another location, where they tell him that the heptapods understand advanced concepts but don't respond to basic ideas like algebra. In response, Ian says, Well, that doesn't make any sense. And then the movie never brings it up again. In Story of Your Life, there are several pages that involve Gary explaining some of those advanced concepts to Louise and how it seems backwards that the heptapods can understand that, but not the basics. In the audiobook, you'll miss this, but here's some nice images to help explain this in the book. The physics concept goes like this. Here is the path a beam of light takes through air until it hits the surface of water, refracts, and the path it takes through the water to end up at its destination. But this is a shorter physical path, and if light traveled at a constant speed, this would be the fastest. But light travels slower through water, and this path takes more distance in the water and would take more time to travel this distance. And then here we have a much longer path, but with the minimal distance possible through the water. But because the distance through air is longer, this also takes more time. So the true path that light takes is somewhere in the middle, which happens to be precisely the shortest amount of time possible for light to travel from point A to point B. This is Fermat's principle of least time. But how does the light particle know what the fastest path will be? It seems like it must already know its destination and calculate the fastest possible path beforehand. I believe this was actually explained in this recent Veritasium video, where he explained that light isn't actually just taking the fastest path or knowing its destination in advance. Rather, the light is actually taking all paths simultaneously, but we only see the fastest path because that's where the standing waves interact constructively when they interact destructively elsewhere, so we can't see them without specialized equipment or an experiment. Or something. I admit I watched that video twice and it's still beyond my understanding of mathematics. That's why I study language. But I'm pretty sure that the principle of least time described in the Story of Your Life is a subset of the principle of least action that is explained by Veritasium. His videos on the topic are linked in the description. Gary explains that calculus of variations is needed to describe this mathematically, which is much more advanced, and most physical laws can be described as variational principles or the method we consider to be more fundamental as a cause and effect. Louise compares this to linguistics' concept of an ambiguous sentence. Take the example, the rabbit is ready to eat. One interpretation is that you've finished cooking a rabbit and are serving it for dinner. Another is that you have a pet rabbit and it is ready to start eating its own food. Both are valid interpretations, and just like many physical laws can be explained either by cause and effect or variational principles, many speech phrases can be explained in multiple ways as well. So while we are experiencing and describing the same things, we go about them in fundamentally different ways. The point of this is that, again, it shows how the heptapods don't perceive time linearly with cause and effect, but rather all at once. And because of how different subjects and objects and clauses interact with each other, writing in Heptapod B requires you to know the entire sentence and destination of every part of the phrase before you start. Just like light would have to know its destination and which path minimizes the action. This lack of a beginning and end in time is also depicted visually, most obviously through the use of circles in their writing, but also with the heptapods' bodies themselves. The heptapods are named for their 7 limbs, and while Arrival depicts them where you can see all or most of the limbs from one side, which seems to be the front of their body, the Story of Your Life describes them as being radially symmetric, with no front. For them, every part of their existence has no beginning and no end. And now that we can understand everything about their perception of time, we can think about free will. Arrival doesn't really mention this, but this is one of the major themes in Story of Your Life. Gary explained to her that the laws of physics are time symmetric. There's no real difference between past and future. So theoretically, people could know the future, but practically it's not possible because of free will affecting the events and their outcomes. But the heptapods live their entire life without thinking of things as cause and effect, and they know the future. If Louise sees her entire life simultaneously, now that she's fluent in Heptapod B, does she have free will? Can she choose to live how she wants, or is she compelled to do the things that she knows will cause a certain effect later in her life? One day, after their session with heptapods, Gary asks Louise on a date. They pick up some things from the store for him to cook. While they're at the store, Louise sees a wooden salad bowl. When Louise's daughter is 3 years old, the salad bowl will fall and cut her forehead. Instinctually, Louise reached for the bowl to buy it as she saw it in the store, just as she reached for it as it was falling. She didn't choose to buy the bowl, and she didn't feel some external force making her buy it either, but she felt right doing it, knowing it was part of her story. Louise and the heptapods lived their lives with their actions and motives in perfect harmony with the past and future, not mindlessly abiding by the known future, but never acting against it either. The idea of free will is a philosophical argument that I leave open to you. Consider this final question from the story of your life. If the heptapods know how every conversation they will ever have is going to play out, why speak at all? They know what each other will say, and they already feel like their speech is holding them back by forcing them to say one word at a time. Why speak at all if it doesn't give you anything new? For the heptapods, all language is performative, which is again, of course, a real concept in linguistics. Performative language is when speaking something is the action that we're describing with our speech. At a wedding, everybody knows and anticipates the words, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." But until the minister actually says them, the ceremony doesn't count. Speaking equals doing. And that has always been the story of the heptapods' lives. Now it's the story of Louise's life. If you studied Heptapod B, would it become the story of your life too? Who knows? Well, maybe you already do.